Hey, restless one. Can't sleep again? That's okay. You're here now. And that means you're exactly where you need to be. No stress, no noise, no hurry. This is Dreamside Stories, not your average bedtime storyteller. Let me take you, somewhere far away, to a time when silence was dangerous and every word could be rebellion. We're heading back to the 16th century, to a war that lasted 80 years. A war of faith, of freedom, of voices rising against crowns. The 80 Years' War wasn't just a fight between Spain and a handful of provinces. It was the slow, quiet birth of something radical. The right to think freely, to speak boldly, to believe without fear. So lie back. Let your thoughts drift, as we follow rebels, thinkers, spies, and dreamers. People who stood firm, even when the world told them to kneel. This is a story about courage, about the cost of conviction, about how ideas, not just weapons, shape history. Before the clashing of swords, before the thunder of rebellion, there was only stillness, a silence that crept across a land not yet broken, a land still cloaked in mist and prayer, windmills turning slowly under gray skies. It was not the silence of peace, but the hush before a storm. This is where our story begins. In the heart of the 16th century, Europe was ablaze with questions. The Reformation had cracked the foundation of Christendom, and no throne, no altar, no village chapel was untouched by doubt. Faith divided families, loyalty split cities. Ideas, once chained in monasteries, spilled into streets on printed pages. Yet in the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, something unique was stirring. It was a place of contradictions, rich in trade, yet weary of war, deeply Catholic, yet increasingly tolerant of new beliefs, loyal to the crown, but fiercely protective of its freedoms. And then came Philip. Philip II of Spain, son of Charles V, inherited not just a kingdom, but a responsibility he neither wanted nor understood. To him, the Netherlands were distant provinces, full of profit and potential heresy. He did not speak their languages. He did not walk their streets. He saw their independence not as strength, but as threat. Where his father had ruled with caution, Philip ruled with iron. He appointed foreign bishops, raised taxes without consent, and sent the Spanish Inquisition to sniff out Protestant defiance. Edicts banned unlicensed preaching, unapproved literature, and gatherings outside of church control. The Dutch grumbled, but they did not yet resist. They had weathered kings before. They endured storms. But Philip's grip tightened. Merchants in Antwerp found their goods seized. Farmers in Brabant paid new taxes for wars they did not start. In Leiden and Utrecht, men were arrested for speaking the wrong psalms. Across the countryside, whispers began to rise, and among those who listened was a man born into privilege, but soon called to purpose. Willem van Oranje. William of Orange was a nobleman, a politician, and a survivor. Raised Catholic in the Kiev royal courts, he knew how power worked. He had dined with emperors, commanded troops, and sworn loyalty to Philip himself. But he also walked among his people. He saw the changes, felt the chill, heard the fear, and in that fear, he saw something else. Unity. The people, scattered by dialect, trade, religion, were drawing closer. Not in rebellion, but in shared unease. Lutheran, Calvinist, and Catholic merchants alike bristled under new laws. Rural nobles resented foreign governors. Artisans passed banned books by candlelight. In 1565 it began. A group of nobles formed the Compromise, a petition to the king, pleading for the persecution to end. It was signed not by radicals, but by loyalists, people who had tried to serve and now felt betrayed. They delivered their message to the regent, Margaret of Parma, who read their words in silence. One of her counselors, sneering, dismissed them as mere beggars, and the name stuck, Guzin, the beggars. A badge of shame turned symbol of pride. Within weeks, beggar medallions hung from necks in taverns and city halls. Songs were sung, toasts raised. For the first time, protest had a face. In 1566, it exploded. The Beelden Storm, the iconoclastic fury, began in the countryside. Churches were stripped of images, statues smashed, altars overturned. What began as a protest against excess became a cleansing of fear. People no longer whispered, they shouted. Philip's answer was swift. He sent the Duke of Alva. A general without pity, Alva marched into the Netherlands with thousands of soldiers. His mission was not negotiation, it was punishment. He established the Council of Troubles, quickly known as the Blood Council. Trials were public, executions frequent, towns fined, guilds broken, leaders hanged. The air itself felt colder. Even those who had not joined the Beeldenstorm were now afraid. William, realizing words would no longer be enough, left the court. He crossed into Germany, where he began to gather support. From Protestant princes, from exiled Dutch leaders, from anyone who still believed in a freer land. He did not call it a rebellion, not yet, but he raised money, he built networks. He waited, and in the Netherlands, people watched. They saw the nooses in the square, the smoke rising from village homes, the ships in the harbor, silent and still. But they also remembered. They remembered when the cities had governed themselves, when trade had flowed without fear, when churches had welcomed both old and new, and slowly, painfully, they began to dream again, of a different king, or no king at all, of a land ruled not by Spain, but by law, of freedom. The war had not yet begun, but its breath was warm on every window pane. The silence was gone, the whispers were rising, and soon they would be heard. The storm had broken. Where once there had been whispers and prayers, now there was blood. And where once Dutch hearts had hoped for peace, now they braced for punishment. When Philip II received word of the iconoclastic riots, churches desecrated, altars overturned, saints reduced to rubble, he did not hesitate. This was not just rebellion. This to him was heresy, and heresy required fire. So he sent his most feared servant, Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alva. Alva was not a diplomat. He was not a thinker. He was a hammer. Cold, brilliant, and utterly loyal. Where others might have written letters, Alva marched. He arrived in the Netherlands in 1567 with 10,000 Spanish troops, seasoned veterans, armored and ruthless. Their boots echoed on the stone streets of Dutch cities, and behind them followed silence. His first act was swift and devastating. He established a new court, the Council of Troubles, but the people quickly gave it a darker name, the Blood Council. It was not a court of law, it was a machine. Its purpose was not justice, but fear. Nobles were arrested, mayors, merchants, teachers. Anyone suspected of sympathy for the Guzin, or simply of disloyalty, could be dragged before the council. Evidence was a formality. Guilt, a guarantee. Trials were short. Sentences were death. Even the most prominent were not spared. Lamoral, Count of Egmont, once a loyal commander under Philip, was summoned. So was Philip de Montmorency, Count of Horn. Both had signed the compromise. Both had hoped for reform. Both were executed in Brussels in front of a stunned and silent crowd. Heads rolled, bells rang, and the Dutch understood. This was no longer politics. This was war by other means. The execution sent ripples far beyond the Netherlands. In France, in England, in the Holy Roman Empire, nobles watched with alarm. And in Germany, Willem van Oranje felt a bitter grief harden into purpose. He had tried to stay moderate. He had begged for understanding. But now, there was no middle ground. Willem issued public letters condemning Alva's tyranny. He called on all loyal Netherlanders to resist. He began assembling forces, ragtag at first, a mix of exiles, mercenaries, and desperate men, but united by cause. Resistance, however, was perilous. In the provinces, the Blood Council's shadow grew long. Cities built gallows beside, town halls, informants whispered in taverns. Mothers taught their children to lie when soldiers knocked. Books were buried beneath floorboards. Sermons were memorized and never written down. People learned to pray without moving their lips. Still, rebellion flickered. Along the coasts, the sea beggars became more daring. Their ships, small, fast, flying patched sails, struck Spanish garrisons, raided supply lines, and vanished into fog. They were pirates to the crown, but saints to many Dutch. In April 1572, the tide shifted. A sea beggar fleet captured the port town of Brielle, not as part of a grand strategy, but by opportunity. The garrison was gone. The gates were open, and when the rebels entered, the people did not resist. They cheered. Brielle became a symbol, a spark. More towns followed. Vlissingen, Dordrecht, Gorinchem. One by one, cities declared for the rebellion. Willem returned from exile, cautious but encouraged. He still sought unity, not just among Protestants, but with Catholics too. He wanted freedom of belief, not replacement of tyranny. But the path was narrow. Every city taken was a risk, every alliance fragile. Alva responded as expected, with fire. He laid siege to cities. Naarden was captured and massacred. In Mechelen, the Spanish looted for days. In Haarlem, the siege dragged on for months. But even in defeat, the rebels fought fiercely. For the Dutch, resistance was no longer political. It was personal. Every burned village was a reason to rise. Every executed cousin was fuel for the flame. Willem's letters spread across the provinces, smuggled in crates, sewn into clothes, copied by hand. He called for patience, for strength, for faith. He was not yet a general, but he was a voice, a symbol. And across Europe, people began to wonder, could this small, soggy corner of Spain's empire truly defy the might of Madrid? Could faith and freedom outlast armor and gold? The future was uncertain, but one thing had become clear. The land was no longer gripped by fear alone. It was gripped by resolve. The Low Countries were changing, not with fire or steel, but with thought. In quiet towns and bustling ports, new ideas flowed like the tides. Calvinist preachers crossed the borders from Geneva, smuggling forbidden sermons and hollowed books. Underground printing presses clattered in damp cellars, their metal plates inked with rebellion. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand, not just in Latin, but in Dutch, French, and Flemish. A war of words for every ear. In Antwerp, once the gem of Europe's trade, whispers echoed through merchant halls. Faith, once a private thing, became a question of loyalty. Was obedience to the church obedience to God or to Spain? And what of those who refused? They were arrested, tortured, sometimes executed. But still, the voices grew louder. Women held secret meetings behind bakeries. Children memorized verses by candlelight. In Leiden, students debated scripture like soldiers preparing for battle. And in Delft, rumors of rebellion moved faster than news. By 1567, Spain had had enough. King Philip sent the Duke of Alva, a cold man with colder intentions. He arrived not as a diplomat, but as a sword. Behind him came thousands of soldiers, foreign boots marching across native soil. He established the Council of Troubles, though the people called it something else. The Blood Council. Thousands were condemned, hundreds were beheaded. Among them, two noblemen who had once pleaded for tolerance, Egmont and Horn. Their executions shocked the continent. Their heads were displayed in Brussels. Their names were whispered in every city square. Still, resistance did not vanish. It went deeper. In Friesland, farmers hid fugitives in haylofts. In Utrecht, carpenters nailed shut the doors of Catholic churches abandoned by fleeing priests. In Rotterdam, canals became smuggling routes for banned books and ink-stained letters. Across the rivers and marshes, a shadow state emerged. It had no flag, no anthem, no ruler, only a cause. And behind that cause, Willem van Oranje. He was in exile now, watching, waiting. His letters became lifelines. His plans took root. His faith, cautious, reformed, pragmatic, spread across borders. He studied not only scripture, but strategy. He spoke with German princes, French Huguenots, and English sympathizers. He collected allies, not just soldiers. Not everyone agreed with him. Some wanted full rebellion. Others feared civil war. But he held them together not with power, but with purpose. He wrote of moderation, of unity, of conscience. "I cannot approve the shedding of innocent blood," he said. But he knew. The time was coming when words would no longer be enough. And then came the spark. In 1568, the first shots were fired. They were not grand battles, but skirmishes, raids across rivers, ambushes in forests. Spanish troops were caught off guard. Rebel forces led by Willem's brothers attacked from the east. A small army marched into Friesland, hoping to inspire a national uprising. They were defeated, but the rebellion had begun. The provinces stirred. Towns hesitated. Some closed their gates. Others opened them to rebels. Word of the first clashes spread through Europe. Some courts watched in silence. Others took note. In England, Queen Elizabeth hesitated, but listened. In France, Protestant Huguenots whispered of support. In the Holy Roman Empire, sympathy mingled with caution. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, a new courage began to take shape. Not from victories, but from defiance. Fishermen refused to feed Spanish garrisons. Teachers refused to recite royal prayers. Even beggars wore tokens of the rebellion. The symbol of the Geuzen, once mockery, became honor. And amidst it all, Willem wrote, "I can no longer stand idle. If not I, then who?" It would not be a short fight, nor an easy one, but it had begun, and the people were ready. War has a way of testing not just armies, but souls. By 1570, the 80 Years' War had ceased to be a mere revolt. It had become a war of identity, of faith, nationhood, and endurance. And like all long wars, it began to consume everything: homes, hopes, even the language people used to pray. For the Spanish, this was a holy war. Philip II saw himself as the guardian of Catholicism, the chosen sword of God in a heretical world. To let the Low Countries fall into Protestant hands was not only a political loss, but a spiritual betrayal. His armies marched not only for territory, but for salvation. They brought priests with them, and inquisitors. They rebaptized towns by force. They burned books and broke altars. And everywhere they went, they demanded loyalty, not just to Spain, but to Rome. For the Dutch, faith had become something else. For some, it was Calvinism, harsh and pure. For others, it was Lutheranism, or a more moderate path. But what united them was not doctrine, but defiance. They believed, more than anything, that no king could rule the soul. This belief was not just spoken, it was lived. Families risked everything to attend secret services in barns or forests. Children were baptized at night. Bibles were hidden inside barrels, stitched into coats. To be caught was death. But still, they gathered. They sang. They believed. And, with every crackdown, the Spanish only hardened that belief. Then came 1572. It began in Brielle. The Sea Beggars, that loose band of rebel privateers, captured the port while its garrison was absent. It was not a grand battle. It was almost an accident, but it lit a fire. Other cities followed. Dordrecht declared for the rebels. So did Flushing, then Enkhuizen, and in town after town, Catholic leaders fled or were replaced. Rebel flags were raised. The rebellion had moved from fields to cities. Willem van Oranje returned, cautious but resolute. He did not claim a throne. He did not declare a republic. He offered leadership, and more importantly, tolerance. He spoke to Protestants, yes, but also to Catholics who feared Spain more than reform. In his letters, he wrote, "I fight not for doctrine, but for freedom of conscience." But freedom was not free. Spain responded with fury. Alva unleashed his army on the cities that had declared rebellion. Naarden was taken and slaughtered, men, women, children. The streets ran red. The message was clear. Resistance meant annihilation. Yet the Dutch did not yield. In Haarlem, the citizens resisted a siege that lasted 7 months. They fought with gunpowder, with fire, with bare hands. Women joined the defense. Children carried powder. Old men guarded the walls. And though Haarlem eventually fell, it had cost the Spanish dearly. Then came Leiden. Surrounded, starving, desperate, the city held out. And when the dikes were cut and the waters rose, it was the Dutch who had turned the land itself into a weapon. Spanish troops drowned or fled. Leiden was saved. The stories spread like fire. This was not just rebellion. This was something deeper. A people, unarmed and divided, had stood against the most powerful empire in the world and survived. Not because they were stronger, but because they believed. They believed that a farmer had as much right to worship as a king, that a city had the right to choose its faith and its future. That conscience could not be commanded. This was the price of faith, and they were willing to pay it. By the mid-1570s, the rebellion was no longer a spark. It was a blaze. What had begun as whispers in taverns and scattered skirmishes had grown into full-scale war. Towns were choosing sides, alliances were tested, and across the patchwork of provinces, one truth had become clear. Neutrality was no longer an option. For the people of the Netherlands, the war had crept into their homes. Fathers left fields to fight. Sons disappeared into forests. Daughters ran messages between rebel camps. Entire families moved under cover of night, escaping towns that had declared for Spain or for freedom. Willem van Oranje had become more than a man. He was now a movement. Though he had no crown, no throne, he held the provinces together with ink, with letters, with speeches delivered by others in his name. His vision was a united front, a confederation of faiths, free from Spanish rule and free to believe. But visions, like walls, are tested by storms. In 1576, the storm came. Spain's empire was vast, but its coffers were not bottomless. The war in the Netherlands was bleeding Madrid dry. Spanish soldiers, long unpaid, mutinied. They rampaged across Brabant and Flanders, looting cities, killing civilians, and burning what could not be stolen. Antwerp suffered the worst. The sack of Antwerp, or Sponsefury, as it would be remembered, was a massacre. For 3 days the city burned. Thousands were slaughtered. Gold was taken, churches defiled, women violated. It was not war, it was terror. And it changed everything. Even loyal provinces were shaken. Catholics who had stood with Spain now turned away in disgust. The rebellion, once seen as Protestant defiance, began to look like national survival. In the wake of the fury, something remarkable happened. Representatives from nearly all provinces, both Catholic and Protestant, met in Ghent. There, in 1576, they signed the Fakenma Pacification of Ghent. It was an agreement not just of politics, but of pain. They pledged to drive out Spanish forces, to restore peace, and to respect religious differences. It was fragile, imperfect, but it was unity. For a moment, the Dutch stood together. Willem's hope flickered brighter. He spoke again of tolerance, of a republic, not in name, but in principle. A place where belief was not dictated by blade or altar. But Spain would not retreat so easily. Philip II sent new commanders, new troops, and new threats. The southern provinces, less inclined toward Protestantism, began to question the alliance, and so the unity that had seemed unbreakable began to fray. In 1579, two rival unions formed. To the north, the Choss Union of Utrecht, led by Holland and Zeeland, reaffirmed the goals of the rebellion: freedom of religion, rejection of Spanish, rule and loyalty to Willem. To the south, the Union of Arras, largely Catholic, sought reconciliation with Spain, tired of war, fearful of Protestantism's spread. The line had been drawn, not just in ideology, but in land, in rivers, in blood. Still, the rebellion held. Willem continued to write, to speak, to hold the dream together. His enemies called him heretic, traitor, outlaw. But to many, he remained their only voice. He was the bridge between faiths, the center of gravity in a fractured world. But even bridges can collapse. In 1580, Philip II placed a bounty on Willem's head. Whoever kills him, the edict read, does God and Spain a service. Willem responded not with fear, but with a manifesto, the Apology. In it, he laid bare his cause. He defended his rebellion as just, his faith as sincere, his loyalty to the people as unshakable. He accused Philip not just of tyranny, but of violating the sacred contract between ruler and ruled. It was not a cry for mercy, it was a declaration of dignity. And across the Netherlands, it was copied by hand, read aloud in marketplaces, tucked into coat linings, and passed between believers like Scripture. The battle lines had been drawn. The war had entered a new phase, and the prince who had once tried to bridge the gap between king and people now stood on one side of it, unwavering. Whatever would come next, the world now knew, The Dutch were no longer pleading. They were fighting. By the early 1580s, Willem van Oranje had become more than a rebel. He was the hope of a nation not yet born. He had outlived exile, assassination attempts, political betrayals, and the collapse of unity. He had led armies without a crown, built governments without a capital, and inspired loyalty without demanding it. His power lay not in command, but in conviction. But power built on belief is fragile. In 1581, the Dutch provinces took a historic step. In the act of abjuration, they formally rejected Philip II as their sovereign. They declared that a king who does not protect his people has broken the contract of rule. It was one of the first acts of its kind. A people firing their monarch. They did not install a new king. They did not seek approval from Rome. They simply said, "No more." Europe was stunned. Even those who hated Spain hesitated. To depose a divinely appointed ruler was heresy in the eyes of many. Monarchs watched, nervously. Rebels across the continent took note. But while the ink dried on their declaration, Willem's enemies were sharpening blades. Philip II had not forgotten the man who had defied him for decades. In 1580, he placed a bounty on Willem's head, 25,000 crowns to anyone who would silence him. The offer was not ignored. On July 10, 1584, in the city of Delft, the silence came. Willem was climbing the stairs of his home when a man named Balthazar Gerard approached. Disguised, polite, pious. He drew a pistol and fired at close range. The prince collapsed. He died not in battle, but in his own house, among family, trusting the wrong stranger. The Netherlands wept. His death shook the fragile republic. There was no president, no parliament, no official head of state. There was only Willem, and now he was gone. But what he left behind was not a vacuum. It was a legacy. Across the provinces, bells tolled. Citizens gathered in silence. From Amsterdam to Middelburg, people whispered not just prayers, but promises. They would not surrender. They would not forget. Pamphlets were printed in his honor. Churches rang bells for days. His funeral procession stretched for miles, not gilded, but solemn. Peasants marched beside nobles. Soldiers bowed beside merchants. He had not ruled, but he had led. In the months that followed, the rebellion staggered, but it did not fall. His children took up his banner. His allies reorganized. Foreign support began to trickle in again. And though the road remained long, the people had tasted the possibility of freedom. Willem's death became a rallying cry. He was called the father of the fatherland. And in time, the idea he died for, that a people could choose their ruler, that faith could not be forced, that conscience was sacred, would echo far beyond the Netherlands, into France, into England, into America. It was not just a Dutch idea anymore. It was a human one. And so, in Delft, where a pistol fired and history turned, a legacy began. Not in marble or empire, but in something stronger, in memory. And, over time, the place of his death became a symbol. Visitors came to see the bullet holes in the wall. Children learned his name. Poets wrote verses in his honor. Streets, statues, coins, all carried his image. But the truest monument was invisible, the spirit of resistance he left behind. A spirit that would carry the Dutch through more battles, more sieges, more years of war. But also toward something new, a republic, a nation, a future not built by kings, but by conviction. And in that future, Willem still walked, not in flesh, but in the conscience of a people who refused to kneel. This was not the end. It was a beginning. In the years following Willem van Oranje's death, the Dutch rebellion stood on a knife's edge. The spiritual father of the uprising was gone, and with him, the glue that had held together a fragile coalition of provinces, religions, and interests, yet somehow it endured. Not because the Dutch were united in all things, but because they had grown used to standing alone together. Spain, sensing an opportunity, struck hard. New generals were sent. Old promises were broken. The southern provinces, weary of war and religious division, drifted back into Spanish arms. Only the north remained fully committed to resistance. And so, the divide deepened. But while the south sought stability under Spain, the north began to imagine something different. Not a return to monarchy, not a temporary alliance, but a new kind of state. It had no king, no single ruler, no court in the old sense. But it had power, and it had resolve. The Union of Utrecht, originally just a military pact, began to act like a government. Delegates met regularly. Taxes were collected. Laws were debated. Armies were raised. Treaties were signed. And all of it was done in the name of the States General, not a king, but a council of representatives. By the 1580s, this fledgling confederation of provinces was functioning as a republic in all but name. Foreign powers took notice. England, long wary of Spain, offered cautious support. In 1585, Queen Elizabeth sent the Earl of Leicester with troops and money. For a brief moment, it seemed the Dutch might find a new protector. But cultural friction and Leicester's political missteps made the alliance fragile. He clashed with Dutch leaders, underestimated their self-governance, and returned to England in disappointment. The Dutch, it seemed, would have to walk alone once more. And so they did. The war dragged on, but the Republic held. Each province had its voice, each city its vote. It was messy, slow, and often chaotic, but it worked. Not by command, but by consensus. Meanwhile, the economy adapted, trade routes shifted, new alliances formed. The cities of the north, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Leiden, began to rise in prominence. Merchants, artisans, and thinkers flocked to their walls. The war, though still raging, could not extinguish growth. Religion remained a fault line. Calvinism gained influence, especially in public institutions and education. But in private, tolerance often prevailed. Jews, Anabaptists, and moderate Catholics found spaces, not of full acceptance, but of relative peace. The Dutch had learned that survival depended not on agreement, but on coexistence. The Republic had no formal declaration, no constitution, no coronation, but it had reality, and reality in time becomes identity. By the end of the decade, a phrase began to appear in letters, pamphlets, and speeches. De Republiek der Zeven Verenigde Nederlanden. The Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. It was not yet official, but it was becoming true. What had begun as rebellion was now governance. What had begun in fear was maturing into confidence. And across Europe, monarchs watched with unease. Here was a nation without a king. Here was a people governed not by divine right, but by mutual agreement. Here was an idea, radical, dangerous, and deeply contagious. The Spanish crown still refused to recognize it. The Pope remained silent, but the world could see it taking shape. A republic not born in revolution, but in resistance. And though it had no coronation, it had a founding moment. Not on a battlefield, but in a meeting hall, where men of different provinces and faiths agreed on one thing. They would not be ruled by a foreign king again. They would rule themselves. That quiet, radical decision would echo for centuries. And the Republic, still battered and besieged, would stand. By the dawn of the 1590s, the Dutch revolt had outlived kings, generals, and expectations. What began as a desperate resistance had become a hardened nation. The Republic, though not officially declared, had taken root. Its cities bustled, its trade expanded, and its armies no longer fled at the sound of Spanish drums. The tide, slowly, was beginning to turn. At the heart of this new momentum stood a man, Maurits van Nassau, son of Willem van Oranje. Unlike his father, Maurits was not a statesman of speeches or manifestos. He was a soldier, a strategist, a student of war. Appointed Stadtholder. In several provinces, he devoted himself to turning the ragtag rebel forces into a professional army. And he succeeded. Maurits trained his troops with discipline and modern tactics. He studied fortifications, siege warfare, and movement. Under his leadership, the Dutch army began to win not just skirmishes, but decisive battles. He captured Breda with cunning. He retook Zutphen and Deventer. City by city, fortress by fortress, the North was pushing back. But war is never just fought in the field. In the cities, Dutch trade was flourishing. The VOC. The Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602. It was not merely a business, but a force of empire, wealth, and influence. Spices, silver, and silk flowed into the ports of Amsterdam and Middelburg. The Republic, though still at war, was becoming rich. This wealth, in turn, funded the fight. Cannons were cast, ships built, soldiers paid. The Spanish crown, stretched thin by conflicts in France and with England, began to feel the pressure. What had once seemed like a minor revolt was now draining its treasury and prestige. And as the war ground on, other powers began to reconsider their stance. France, emerging from its own religious wars, began to show interest in weakening Spain. England, still wary of Catholic expansion, provided support where it could. The Republic had allies now, not formal ones, but quiet, useful ones. And yet, despite all this, peace remained distant. The southern provinces, Flanders, Brabant, and others, remained under Spanish control. Their cities, once vibrant, centers of the rebellion, now stood as reminders of what had been lost. Antwerp, once the jewel of European trade, faded under Spanish blockade. The Dutch did not forget these cities, but they no longer believed they could reclaim them by force. So they looked north, east, and across the seas. Expansion became a policy, exploration a mission. The Republic, though born in struggle, was learning to dream. Meanwhile, Moritz continued to lead. But his successes on the battlefield began to create tension off it. In the States General, disagreements emerged. Should the war continue endlessly? Should peace be sought? And what of religion? Should the Republic enforce Calvinism or allow space for dissent? One voice rose in opposition. Johann von Oldenbarnevelt. He was no general. He was a statesman, shrewd, patient, pragmatic. He had helped shape the Republic's foundations, and he believed that peace, not endless war, was the way forward. Moritz and Oldenbarnevelt were allies once, but now they drifted. Their rivalry mirrored a deeper question within the Republic itself. Was this a nation of tolerance or a Calvinist state? Was it to be ruled by soldiers or by laws? The answers were unclear, but the questions would soon erupt. For now, though, the Republic stood stronger than ever. Its ships ruled northern seas. Its cities pulsed with trade. Its borders held. And in the eyes of Europe, it was no longer a rebellion. It was becoming a country, not through treaties, not through coronations, but through persistence. The tide was turning, and the Dutch were learning to sail it. As the Republic solidified its position on the European stage, its greatest threat no longer came from abroad, but from within. The early 1600s were a time of triumph. The war with Spain had not yet ended, but many cities were secure. The economy was flourishing. The Dutch fleet ruled vital trade routes. Art, science, and philosophy blossomed in the towns and universities. The outside world saw a thriving young nation, but inside the Republic, a storm was gathering. At its heart were two men, Maurits van Nassau-Charles and Johann van Oldenbarnevelt. Maurits had become a national hero. His military reforms, battlefield, victories, and leadership as stadtholder earned him respect and loyalty from much of the army and common people. He was seen as a continuation of his father's legacy, the sword of the Republic. Oldenbarnevelt, in contrast, was the architect of the Republic's laws and diplomacy. He had negotiated foreign alliances, structured the States General, and advocated for religious tolerance. His vision was civil, legal, and rooted in negotiation, the pen to Maurits's sword. For years, the two men worked together. But as the Republic grew stronger, their differences sharpened. The core conflict was no longer about Spain. It was about religion and power. The Dutch Reformed Church, now dominant, had internal divisions. One side, the Remonstrants, argued for a softer, more tolerant interpretation of Calvinism, one that left space for free will and diverse thought. Oldenbarnevelt supported them. He feared dogma would split the Republic. The other side, the counter-remonstrants, held to stricter doctrine, predestination, firm ecclesiastical authority, and close ties between church and state. They had the backing of Maurits. What began as theological debate spilled into the streets. Riots broke out in cities. Churches were seized. Local militias took sides. Ministers preached not of unity, but of betrayal. Brothers stopped speaking. Councils collapsed. The Republic, which had survived war with Spain, now teetered under the weight of internal division. Oldenbarnevelt pushed for compromise. He urged provincial sovereignty, allowing each province to decide its own religious policy. He believed the Republic must remain pluralistic to survive. Maurits, now more powerful than ever, saw this as weakness. He marched troops into cities loyal to the Remonstrants. One by one, he replaced civic leaders with loyalists. He presented it as restoring order, but it was a quiet coup. In 1618, he made his move. Oldenbarnevelt was arrested on charges of treason. So were his allies. The trial was political, not legal. The outcome was never in doubt. On May 13, 1619, Johann van Oldenbarnevelt, the man who had guided the Republic through its infancy, who had written its laws and treaties, was executed in The Hague. He was 71 years old. He walked to the scaffold with dignity. His last words were simple. "Men do not understand the cause for which I die." The axe fell, and a part of the Republic's soul fell with it. Maurits continued to rule, but he had lost the one man who had kept his power in balance. The Republic survived, yes, but it had changed. The ideal of unity through difference had been wounded. In the years that followed, the Remonstrants were suppressed. Many fled or went underground. Public life became more uniform. The Republic remained tolerant by European standards, but it was no longer as open as it had been. Still, the legacy of the conflict endured. Oldenbarnevelt became a symbol of principle, of law, of conscience against might. His name would be invoked in future struggles for justice. And Maurits, for all his victories, would never fully escape the shadow of the scaffold. The brothers who had once built the Republic, the sword and the pen, had turned against one another. and in doing so, reminded all who followed that freedom, once won, must be defended not only from tyrants, but from ourselves. As the Republic solidified its position on the European stage, its greatest threat no longer came from abroad, but from within. The early 1600s were a time of triumph. The war with Spain had not yet ended, but many cities were secure. The economy was flourishing. The Dutch fleet ruled vital trade routes. Art, science, and philosophy blossomed in the towns and universities. The outside world saw a thriving young nation. But inside the Republic, a storm was gathering. At its heart were two men, Maurits van Nassau and Johann van Oldenbarnevelt. Maurits had become a national hero. His military reforms, battlefield, victories and leadership as stadtholder earned him respect and loyalty from much of the army and common people. He was seen as a continuation of his father's legacy, the sword of the Republic. Oldenbarnevelt, in contrast, was the architect of the Republic's laws and diplomacy. He had negotiated foreign alliances, structured the States General, and advocated for religious tolerance. His vision was civil, legal, and rooted in negotiation, the pen to Maurits's sword. For years, the two men worked together. But as the Republic grew stronger, their differences sharpened. The core conflict was no longer about Spain. It was about religion and power. The Dutch Reformed Church, now dominant, had internal divisions. One side, the Remonstrants, argued for a softer, more tolerant interpretation of Calvinism, one that left space for free will and diverse thought. Oldenbarnevelt supported them. He feared dogma would split the Republic. The other side, the counter-remonstrants, held to stricter doctrine, predestination, firm ecclesiastical authority, and close ties between church and state. They had the backing of Maurits. What began as theological debate spilled into the streets. Riots broke out in cities. Churches were seized. Local militias took sides. Ministers preached not of unity, but of betrayal. Brothers stopped speaking. Councils collapsed. The Republic, which had survived war with Spain, now teetered under the weight of internal division. Oldenbarnevelt pushed for compromise. He urged provincial sovereignty, allowing each province to decide its own religious policy. He believed the Republic must remain pluralistic to survive. Maurits, now more powerful than ever, saw this as weakness. He marched troops into cities loyal to the Remonstrants. One by one, he replaced civic leaders with loyalists. He presented it as restoring order, but it was a quiet coup. In 1618, he made his move. Oldenbarnevelt was arrested on charges of treason. So were his allies. The trial was political, not legal. The outcome was never in doubt. On May 13th, 1619, Johann van Oldenbarnevelt, the man who had guided the Republic through its infancy, who had written its laws and treaties, was executed in The Hague. He was 71 years old. He walked to the scaffold with dignity. His last words were simple. "Men do not understand the cause for which I die." The axe fell, and a part of the Republic's soul fell with it. Maurits continued to rule, but he had lost the one man who had kept his power in balance. The Republic survived, yes, but it had changed. The ideal of unity through difference had been wounded. In the years that followed, the Remonstrants were suppressed. Many fled or went underground. Public life became more uniform. The Republic remained tolerant by European standards, but it was no longer as open as it had been. Still, the legacy of the conflict endured. Oldenbarnevelt became a symbol of principle, of law, of conscience against might. His name would be invoked in future struggles for justice, and Moritz, for all his victories, would never fully escape the shadow of the scaffold. The brothers who had once built the Republic, the sword and the pen, had turned against one another, and in doing so, reminded all who followed that freedom, once won, must be defended not only from tyrants, but from ourselves. As the Republic solidified its position on the European stage, its greatest threat no longer came from abroad, but from within. The early 1600s were a time of triumph. The war with Spain had not yet ended, but many cities were secure. The economy was flourishing. The Dutch fleet ruled vital trade routes. Art, science, and philosophy blossomed in the towns and universities. The outside world saw a thriving young nation. But inside the Republic, a storm was gathering. At its heart were two men, Moritz van Nassau and Johann van Oldenbarnevelt. Moritz had become a national hero. His military reforms, battlefield, victories, and leadership as stadtholder earned him respect and loyalty from much of the army and common people. He was seen as a continuation of his father's legacy, the sword of the Republic. Oldenbarnevelt, in contrast, was the architect of the Republic's laws and diplomacy. He had negotiated foreign alliances, structured the States General, and advocated for religious tolerance. His vision was civil, legal, and rooted in negotiation, the pen to Moritz's sword. For years, the two men worked together. But as the Republic grew stronger, their differences sharpened. The core conflict was no longer about Spain. It was about religion and power. The Dutch Reformed Church, now dominant, had internal divisions. One side, the Remonstrants, argued for a softer, more tolerant interpretation of Calvinism, one that left space for free will and diverse thought. Oldenbarnevelt supported them. He feared dogma would split the Republic. The other side, the counter-remonstrants, held to stricter doctrine, predestination, firm ecclesiastical authority, and close ties between church and state. They had the backing of Moritz. What began as theological debates spilled into the streets. Riots broke out in cities. Churches were seized. Local militias took sides. Ministers preached not of unity, but of betrayal. Brothers stopped speaking. Councils collapsed. The Republic, which had survived war with Spain, now teetered under the weight of internal division. Oldenbarnevelt pushed for compromise. He urged provincial sovereignty, allowing each province to decide its own religious policy. He believed the Republic must remain pluralistic to survive. Moritz, now more powerful than ever, saw this as weakness. He marched troops into cities loyal to the Remonstrants. One by one, he replaced civic leaders with loyalists. He presented it as restoring order, but it was a quiet coup. In 1618, he made his move. Oldenbarnevelt was arrested on charges of treason. So were his allies. The trial was political, not legal. The outcome was never in doubt. On May 13, 1619, Johann von Oldenbarnevelt, the man who had guided the Republic through its infancy, who had written its laws and treaties, was executed in The Hague. He was 71 years old. He walked to the scaffold with dignity. His last words were simple. Men do not understand the cause for which I die. The axe fell, and a part of the Republic's soul fell with it. Moritz continued to rule, but he had lost the one man who had kept his power in balance. The Republic survived, yes, but it had changed. The ideal of unity through difference had been wounded. In the years that followed, the Remonstrants were suppressed. Many fled or went underground. Public life became more uniform. The Republic remained tolerant by European standards, but it was no longer as open as it had been. Still, the legacy of the conflict endured. Oldenbarnevelt became a symbol of principle, of law, of conscience against might. His name would be invoked in future struggles for justice, and Maurits, for all his victories, would never fully escape the shadow of the scaffold. The brothers who had once built the Republic, the sword and the pen, had turned against one another, and in doing so, reminded all who followed that freedom, once won, must be defended not only from tyrants, but from ourselves. The story of the 80 Years' War ends not with a bang, but with a breath. A long exhale after decades of holding it in. It is easy to measure history by battles and treaties, by borders drawn and thrones toppled. But the true weight of this war lies elsewhere, in the lives it shaped, the minds it freed, and the dreams it dared to keep alive. From the first protests in the streets of the Spanish Netherlands to the final signatures in Münster, the Dutch people endured nearly a century of fear, faith, and fight. A war that began as a cry against taxes and repression became something far greater. A revolution in thought, in identity, in sovereignty. It was not just about freedom from Spain. It was about the right to choose one's own path. In belief, in governance, in destiny. What makes this story remarkable is not just that a small, flat land defied the mightiest empire of its time. It is that they did so not in perfect unity, but in fragile alliance. Catholics and Protestants, merchants and farmers, princes and preachers. Their disagreements were deep, and their visions often clashed. But what they shared was stronger, the refusal to be ruled without reason. The Dutch Republic, when it emerged, was unlike anything the world had seen. It had no king, no divine mandate, no centralized power. It was a patchwork, a confederation of cities and provinces, bound not by blood, but by mutual agreement. Its strength was its cooperation. Its power was in its people. The Republic survived invasion, assassination, economic warfare, religious turmoil, and still it stood. And what it built, from art to science, from commerce to philosophy, reshaped not just Europe, but the world. Yet this war is not just a Dutch story. It is a human story. It is the story of those who resisted, in silence and in song, of mothers who taught banned prayers in whispers, of sailors who smuggled more than goods, of thinkers who defied dogma, of fighters who picked up arms not for glory, but for dignity. It is the story of a people who, when told to kneel, stood. And in that act, they changed what it meant to be, a nation. We remember names like Willem van Oranje and Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. We study the battles, the unions, the treaties. But behind every headline of history are 1,000 untold acts. Small, quiet, essential. The father who refused to recant. The widow who carried messages beneath her cloak. The child who dreamed one day of peace. It is for them that this story matters, because their spirit lives on, not in museums or memorials, but in every corner of the world where freedom is still fought for. Their war is over, but the struggle they began continues. Wherever people rise against tyranny, wherever belief is tested, wherever the future remains unwritten, in the flicker of candlelight in a hidden room, in the sound of church bells ringing for peace, in the voices of those who say again and again, no more. The 80 Years' War has passed into history, but its echo remains, steady, distant, and alive. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. A whisper, a warning, a promise.